We're into July now and halfway through the year, and the emphasis is kind of changing. We were pairing snakes up in the early part of the year. We now have eggs in the incubator. We have some females that are still progressing and expected to lay, and we have some females that are obviously not going to lay. So I thought I'd take the opportunity of just talking us through how we got to this stage, starting at the beginning of the breeding season, what I do to breed my females. So seasoned breeders, you can switch off now. There probably isn't much information here that you don't already know, but for guys just starting out in the hobby, and particularly those here in Malaysia that are keeping snakes with no heating mats, just using ambient temperature, only have a handful of snakes like me. I started the year with 6 snakes that were ready to breed, 6 females, and I added 1 later in the year. I also don't have ultrasound, so very old school system I use here. So let's kick off with how I selected the females at the beginning of the year. 2 years old or more, 1,500 grams or more, but I'm looking for more than that. I'm looking for condition in my snakes. I've got a couple of snakes here that I just want to show you how I'd select the females that will breed and the females that probably won't. So if we take a look at this girl in here, this girl has been bred this year. She's not a very big snake, she's 3 years old. She bred last year. But you can see she's about 2.5, 2 kilos. But you can see that she's quite thick, particularly down at the rear end of the snake. Let me just see if I can hold that up for you. So the rear of the snake is quite thick, particularly towards the bottom end. So the follicles, let me just put it back on the table. The follicles are going to grow in this part of the snake here, and the fat reserves of the females are kept towards the rear of the snake. So what we're looking for here is thickness in this part of the body, particularly down towards the rear of the snake. So if I just get another snake out by comparison, if this girl's going to keep still for me. This girl is about the same age, and she's actually a longer snake. But you can see side by side, this girl's very active here now, you can see side by side the difference in the thickness and the girth of the snake. This one is a long and thin snake, and this one is much thicker. So this is one that I would consider breeding. This one probably isn't going to breed this year. You can see she's actually quite thin towards the bottom end, whereas this girl here is quite chunky towards the bottom end. So I select my snakes not just on the basis of age and weight, but also on condition. Here, if we get a look at this girl, you can see that she's a very long snake, but she's very thin. And she was actually a donor snake. It was loaned to me by a friend who wanted to breed his snake. He was also having trouble getting her to eat, so I got her quite late in the year. I didn't get her until December, and we tried to get her fattening up. I had no problems at all getting her to lock, but she just didn't build. She stayed thin, and she's clearly not going to lay this year. So at the start of the year, I selected my snakes. We had 6 females that were up to size and all looked in good condition. And what I do here, you can see on the racks, I have a system of tags and labels. The labels on the tubs are just feeding cards with the dates that the snakes were fed, and the label on the back is what the snake actually is. So that's the feeding label. That's on all of the snakes. And as we progress through the season, I use a red tag here for shedding. So snakes that are in shed, they just get the tab just tucked onto their rack like that, so that I know that they're shedding. So The process then is I don't use any cooling during the year. I started pairing my snakes up in November, so I'd already selected the pairings, and I use a whiteboard. You do need to take notes, guys. You will need to take notes and use a breeding book. The breeding book here I use to note down. Each snake has its own page, and I use the book to note down locks, sheds. Not a feeding book, but just the stuff related to breeding. When a female goes off food, it's noted in there. Prelay sheds, noted in there. Ovulations, that sort of thing. Everything related to breeding. That's noted down in the book, but I also use a whiteboard. And the whiteboard here is, you can see that the females are all listed down this side. Their pairings listed here, and the dates that they were last paired up, and either green or red for yes they did lock or no they didn't lock down here, so that I can see when I walk into the snake room at a glance which snakes need to be looked at for pairing again. I typically pair up my snakes once every 3 weeks, every 3 to 4 weeks, based upon this schedule here. But it depends when the snakes are going into shed. If your female's in shed or your male's in shed, typically I won't pair a snake up if it's actually in shed. I'll wait until it finishes shedding. So obviously you have to juggle the dates around to suit your snake's shedding schedule. The snake that I added late in the season was a pied female. This girl here, she actually reached a weight quite late in the year. So I didn't start pairing her up until about January. She didn't lock up for me the first time until quite late in the year. May, I think, was the first time that she locked. So she's quite late, but after she locked, she did start slamming food. You can see that she is thickening up. She's eating really, really well. If I do get a clutch from this girl, it will be late in the season, but I'll continue to pair her up a couple more times just to give her a chance at breeding this year. Whereas most of my other pairings finished in June. The snakes will either lay eggs or not lay eggs now, so I'm not pairing up the snakes. What I do when I pair up snakes, and this one is actually due to be paired up again, so the female stays in her tub and you bring the male to the female. So here is the male that I'm using for this girl. Here's the male. The male goes in with the female, and it really is that simple. And then I put the female back into her rack. Like so. And what I'm looking for when I introduce a male is some sort of interest from both the male and the female. If the snakes go to opposite ends of the tub, they're obviously not interested, but generally speaking you can see fairly quickly whether the male and the female are interested, and generally the snakes will lock up fairly quickly. So I monitor their behaviour. I like to see the male actually touching the female or laying on top of the female. That's always a good sign, and you can actually see the lock when they lock if you observe the snakes. But try not to disturb them too much. And the male will go in with the female for 3 days, unless I see a visual lock. When he's finished, when he's done, I will remove him and put him back into his tub, and that's the job done. So you don't need to leave them for 3 days if they lock up immediately, but if they don't lock immediately, 3 days is the longest I'll leave them. And then I'll put the male back into his tub, and I will leave the female. The male goes back into his tub, and he goes back onto the feeding cycle as well. So he will be offered food at the same intervals that all the other snakes are offered food. You need to be careful of your males a little bit, because sometimes when they're breeding they will go off of food. A big guy like this, that's no issue. He can go for months without food. But if it's a first time male and he's quite small, when you breed, just watch your smaller males. If they go off food and they start to lose condition, a snake can actually breed itself to death. So your smaller males, and I did have one this year that went off food for about 2 months. I was breeding him to a female, and he stopped eating altogether, and I started to get a little bit worried because he wasn't eating. So I pulled him from the breeding schedule, put him back into his tub, and he has actually started eating again now. I didn't pair him up for several weeks and he eventually went back onto food. What I would do for that male, if he hadn't gone back onto food, is actually move him out of this breeding room and put him into another room. I've got plenty of rooms that I can use that are non-air conditioned, suitable for the snake. So it's an easy job just to move the tub and get him away from the scent of the females, just to get him back on feeding. Typically, if you have one male that's going to breed a lot of females, you need to keep a closer eye on the male. But if you're just pairing up, if you just have a few snakes and the male is only going to go in with 1 or 2 females, generally it's not too much of a burden on them. Just watch to make sure that they are eating. Sometimes they won't eat for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they'll eat and then not eat for another week or 2. That's not a problem. Just watch the snake and make sure that it isn't losing condition. But the smaller males, you do have to be a little bit careful of. Once the female goes back into a tub, we use a green tag, which means that she is now a breeding female. And I put a date on here for the date that they were paired, and I also mark it up in the whiteboard, and I'll write it in the book as well. The book is a little bit more detailed record, and this is a glance at what the status is when I come back into the room. On the whiteboard I can see when the last pairings were and when they're about due to be paired again. What I'm looking for in the female, because I don't have an ultrasound, I'm looking for the female to actually start beefing up, watching her grow, and she will go heavily onto food. Her feeding response will become quite aggressive. She'll be slamming food a lot more than she normally does, and she will go through a phase of really eating really strongly. And when they do go through that phase, I like to give them a little bit of extra food. Not necessarily bigger food, but if they want a second rat, if they're still hungry, I'll feed them a second rat, just to give them the reserves that they need to build follicles. Your female, in this environment, there's no heat mat or anything, but the water bowls in the tubs are a little bit cooler than the rest of the tub because of evaporation. I've actually done tests with a heat gun. You may have seen the video earlier in the year that I did, where the water bowls are actually quite a bit cooler than the rest of the tub. So you will see your female bowl wrapping. It's a very recognizable symptom of them building follicles. So they're trying to cool down, their feed response increases, they're cooling down, and you'll see them chunking up, particularly in the rear third of the body. You'll see the snake getting much thicker. That's a really good sign that they're building well. Continue to pair the male with that female and watch out for visual locks about once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks. A really good time to put the male in with the female is just after she's shed. Leave the tub with the female shed inside the tub and put the male in there, because all the pheromones and scent are really strong just after she's shed. And sometimes a male that's a little bit reluctant will be turned on by the additional scent just after shedding. So that's a really good time. Something else to watch out for with the males and females, on a rainy night, if you get a rainstorm coming through and it's very humid, that's also a good time to pair your snake. So about every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, that's about the sort of schedule depending upon when your snakes are shedding. I don't pair when the male is in shed. He's very unlikely to breed when he's in shed. Females sometimes still will, but I prefer to wait until just after she's shed because she tends to be a little bit more receptive. So that takes us through the initial part of the season with the pairings, and your females are building follicles in the process of laying. What you will see when you put the males in, once the female definitely starts to build follicles, is she become extremely receptive. You put the male in with the female and they'll lock almost straight away. I have snakes that only take about an hour to lock up once they go in. I don't have any real problems with locking. So that's also a really good sign. Once the female starts to build follicles and the follicles get to a certain size, her digestive system is restricted because she's growing these proto-eggs or follicles inside her body. There's less and less room for the digestive process, less and less room for food, and she will, as the season progresses, if she's going to go on to lay, she will sooner or later go off food. She'll stop eating, she'll refuse food, there's no room for food in there, and it's fairly normal for a female to go off food for several months. She may go for 3 months, 90 days without feeding until she actually lays. So I use another tag for that. My females get these tags, which means that they've gone off food. I will continue to offer food, I'll continue to offer smaller prey, and they stay in the room and get the scent of prey when the other snakes are fed, but if they're off food they get this symbol here. So once they get to that stage, you can continue to pair your snakes again every 3 to 4 weeks, even though she's not eating, but she should be looking nice and thick. She should have built up, through that stage where she's eating really strongly, she should have built up a nice thickness and some fat reserves that she's going to need when she's no longer eating. So once they go off food, keep pairing. Depending upon the snake and how long they've been off food, you will be looking for an ovulation. And ovulations are not always obvious, but it's a distinctive swelling in the lower third of the snake. I think you can Google that, you've seen pictures of it, but just be aware it's not always completely obvious. Once you get to know your snakes, you will recognize ovulation and you'll recognize a different sort of behavior. Once the snake has ovulated, you no longer need to pair. So they ovulate, and about 20 days after ovulation, give or take, it's not a firm schedule, some snakes do, some snakes don't. Again, watch your snakes, take notes, note it down in your breeding book, so that next season when you breed the snake, if it does the same thing, you'll know what the schedule is. But about 20 days after they've ovulated, they will shed, and that's the pre-lay shed. No different to any other kind of shed. There are no differences. She will go through the shed process. Once she has ovulated, she is going to lay. She will lay eggs, and those eggs will either be fertile eggs or they'll be slugs. Hopefully they'll be fertile eggs if she's visited with a male enough times, and that's why you keep cycling the male through until ovulation, just so that she has enough stored sperm to make sure that all those eggs are fertile. So once she's had a pre-lay shed, you will notice again a change in behavior. She'll no longer be trying to cool down and hugging the water bowl. She will move to the back of the cage and she'll become very lethargic. And about 30 days after the pre-lay shed, sometimes sooner, sometimes a little bit later. My snake's generally a little bit late, anywhere between 33, 37 days after the pre-lay shed, they will lay. Because these snakes are kept on paper, I do like to put a little bit of substrate in there, just a little bit of cocoa husk and some sphagnum moss, and I can usually wet that down a little bit once or twice a week just to give them that little bit of extra humidity. But it just gives the females something to nest in. You'll see the nesting behavior. They like to burrow down into something, or they'll crawl underneath the paper and they'll curl up into a ball, and they'll be very inactive. During that period, you'll also see them pulling all sorts of weird shapes. They'll wrap themselves upside down, so you'll see the belly. The female will be upside down with her belly showing and her head sticking out from the middle of the coils there. And that stage there is she's already ovulated, the eggs are inside her there, and she's a little bit uncomfortable, and sometimes they just need to readjust their insides and get into a comfortable position. So that's another good sign before the snakes lay. So that's the stage that we're at now. We have eggs in the incubator, we have snakes that are going to lay, we have snakes that are clearly not going to lay this year, and we've finished our pairings apart from the one snake that I showed you earlier. So we're looking forward to the hatchling season, and it's not too early in the season to again to take my breeding book and to start making a list of all the available females that I think I might have up to size for next year. And it's going to go from 6 snakes or 7 snakes that I had this year up to 15 snakes. This is very early in the year, but it's quite important to make sure that your females that you are planning to breed are feeding well, that they're healthy, and that they're a nice chunky size, not skinny like the snake that I showed you earlier, to give them the best chance of breeding. So now is the time that you start thinking about pairings. It's a way off yet, and I don't know which snakes will go and which snakes won't, but you can start to map out which males are going to go to which females, and you can also start to consider feeding your breeder females a little bit heavily and just monitoring them to make sure that they're back up to size and they're in good condition in preparation for the breeding season. So it is worth noting down, and observing the behavior of your snakes, making sure that they're feeding. So that's the stage that we're at now. I do have eggs that are due to hatch next month, so we'll have hatchlings. So as we move forward through the breeding season, we'll be taking a look at some of the hatchlings. And for you guys, again, that are new to the hobby, nothing new here for seasoned breeders, but just for those that have never seen it before, we'll do a couple of videos on how we set up our hatchlings. We'll do an egg cutting, we'll have a look at some of the babies, and we'll set up in my hatchling rack, and I'll walk you guys through the process of how I get my hatchlings feeding, how I establish them and get them growing. So that will be a separate video when we have the hatchlings to work with, but yes, we'll walk through how to establish your hatchlings, how to get them feeding, how to get them growing on. So that's where we're at in the snake room today. We've seen a few snakes. That's the process that I use. It's not a unique process. There are many different ways of doing it. That's how I do it. Some of the things that I'm looking at doing differently next season, as I said, this room is ambient, so it's at about 30 degrees C. I am going to try a cooling period at the end of the year. Before I start pairing up my snakes, I'm going to switch the air conditioning on and drop the temperature by a couple of degrees. So from around 30 degrees to 28 degrees, just a little drop in temperature to encourage the snakes to breed. I haven't had a problem with getting my snakes to breed using the natural monsoon cycles. The rainy season is when I start to pair them up, when it's naturally a little bit cooler. But I'm just going to enhance that process with the air conditioning, just to see if I can get a little bit more success rate. As I said, I started with 6 snakes this season, and it looks like I've got 1 has already laid, 2 are going to lay, 2 are maybes, and 1 is definitely not going to with that. It's a learning process, so there's always something new to learn. The important thing is that you observe your snakes. Take notes, guys, and it's particularly important to take note of pairings, so that when you do get the hatchlings, and again we'll take a look at that when we get some of the hatchlings, some of these hatchlings are going to have 5 or 6 genes at play, and unless you take note of the pairings and you know what snakes have bred to what, you're stabbing in the dark as to what the snakes might be. So take a note of your pairings, the genes that are at play, and what the likely outcomes are, and that will help you when it comes time to identifying what the babies actually are. Something for another video, but we'll run through that process too. So very important, guys, to take notes. I'm old school. You can do it on the computer. I use a notebook and I use a whiteboard. That's worked quite effectively for me so far, so we'll continue to use that. I will see if I can get some software as I get more snakes, because as I said, I'm going to have 15 snakes next year. It's going to be more work than just the 6 snakes I had this year. So looking forward to that, looking forward to the hatchlings, looking forward to seeing what sort of babies I produce this year, and whether some of my breeder females go on to lay eggs. So still a lot more to come, but that's the first 6 months of the breeding season in a nutshell. What I did, how I got to this point, and what to watch out for. If you're new to breeding ball pythons, give it a go. It's not hard. The snakes don't need a great deal of help, as you saw there. Just put the male in with the females, stick them back in the rack, and let them get on with their thing. They do tend to do things quite nicely by themselves. They don't need much help from us. So give it a go, guys. That's what I do. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.